The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor flickered as Garrett Walsh gripped the cold metal railing, watching his 6-year-old daughter sleep through the glass window. Her pale face, the beeping monitors, the IV drip, all reminders that time was running out. 3 months until her kidneys failed completely. $120,000 he didn't have. Behind him, a voice cut through the sterile silence, smooth, controlled, expensive. "I need a boyfriend to meet my parents this weekend." He turned to face the CEO he'd just fixed a broken pipe for, her designer heels clicking against the tile, her eyes holding something he couldn't quite read. Desperation? Loneliness? She named a figure, the exact cost of Rosie's transplant. His throat tightened. I'm just nobody, right?" His voice cracked, the words stumbling out. She stepped closer, her perfume mixing with antiseptic. "You're exactly who I need." But in her eyes, he saw the same thing reflected in the hospital glass. Someone fighting to save something precious before it slipped away. What happens when two strangers make a deal that wasn't supposed to change anything? Garrett Walsh had learned to carry exhaustion like a second skin. At 37, his body knew the rhythm of 3 jobs: mornings fixing pipes and electrical wiring for apartment complexes, afternoons doing handyman work for small businesses, nights cleaning office buildings downtown. His hands bore the evidence of each day's labor, calloused palms and scraped knuckles that he'd long stopped bandaging. The work kept him upright, kept the bills manageable, kept Rosie's medication bottles filled. It didn't keep him from falling asleep standing up in grocery store lines or forgetting which day of the week it was. But it kept them going, and that was enough. Rosie was the reason for everything. 6 years old with curls that bounced when she laughed and eyes that still found wonder in the smallest things, despite spending half her life in hospital rooms. She'd been born with kidney dysplasia, and for years they'd managed with treatments and hope. But last month, the doctor's words had landed like stones in Garrett's chest. "We need to talk about transplant options soon. Her kidneys are deteriorating faster than we hoped." The number came next, clinical and devastating. $120,000, not counting the follow-up care. Garrett's savings account held $7,342. He'd been adding to it for 4 years, dollar by dollar, and it still wasn't even close. Tonight, he was finishing his shift at the Morgan Financial Tower, a gleaming 30-story building in the business district, where he mopped floors and fixed whatever broke. The building's occupants barely noticed him. He was part of the invisible infrastructure, like the plumbing or the heating vents. He preferred it that way. Anonymity meant no pity, no questions about why a man his age was pushing a mop bucket at 11 at night. He'd just finished repairing a burst pipe in the executive suite bathroom when he'd stopped by the hospital to check on Rosie. His sister was watching her tonight, but he couldn't sleep without seeing his daughter first, without watching the rise and fall of her small chest, and reminding himself that she was still here. Still fighting. The woman's voice had startled him out of his thoughts. Juliet Morgan. He recognized her from the building directory and the occasional glimpse in elevators. Always impeccably dressed, always moving with purpose, always surrounded by an aura that screamed success and untouchability. She was the CEO of Morgan Financial, a woman who'd built her late father's struggling investment firm into a powerhouse. Garrett had fixed the sink in her office twice, changed light bulbs in her conference room, and she'd never once looked directly at him until tonight. Now she stood in a hospital corridor at midnight, looking somehow both perfectly composed and utterly exhausted, and she was asking him to pretend to be her boyfriend. "I don't understand," Garrett said slowly, his mind struggling to process the surreal conversation. "Why would you need to hire someone for that?" "Why me?" Juliet's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, a crack in the armor. "My mother is dying, stage 4 cancer. She has weeks, maybe days. And all she wants before she goes is to see me happy, settled, with someone who cares about me. Her voice remained steady, professional, but her fingers twisted the strap of her designer handbag. I've spent my entire life building a company, and I forgot to build anything else. My parents' 35th wedding anniversary is this weekend. It's likely the last celebration my mother will attend. I need to give her peace. Garrett wanted to walk away. Every instinct told him this was wrong, that accepting money to deceive a dying woman crossed a line he'd never thought he'd consider. But then Juliet said the number, $50,000 for 3 days, and his carefully constructed resolve crumbled. It wasn't the full amount Rosie needed, but it was close enough that he could maybe, possibly, find a way to bridge the gap. His hands shook as he gripped the railing tighter. "Why me?" he asked again, his voice barely a whisper. Juliet looked through the glass at Rosie, her expression softening in a way that seemed almost painful. "Because 2 hours ago, I was here visiting my mother. I saw you reading to your daughter. The way you held her, the gentleness in your voice. That's not something that can be faked. My mother would see through any actor I hired. But you're real." The next morning felt like stepping into someone else's life. Juliet had given him an address in the historic district, a renovated brownstone that probably cost more than Garrett would earn in a lifetime. She opened the door, wearing jeans and a simple white sweater, looking almost human without the business armor. Her apartment was all clean lines and expensive art, the kind of space that felt more like a museum than a home. She gestured for him to sit, then launched into what she called the briefing, with the efficiency of someone planning a corporate merger. "We met 6 months ago when you came to fix something in my office. We've been seeing each other quietly, because I don't like mixing my personal and professional life. We're serious, but taking things slowly, because we both have responsibilities. You have your daughter, I have my company." Garrett listened, feeling increasingly surreal about the entire situation. Juliet handed him a folder containing printed pages, details about her family, her childhood, her mother's favorite flowers and books. "You'll need to know these things. My mother is sharp, even now. She'll ask questions." He scanned the pages, taking in information about a life so different from his own, it might as well have been fiction. Summer homes in the Hamptons, private schools in Connecticut, charity galas and yacht clubs. "What do I tell her about myself?" he asked. Juliet met his eyes. "The truth. My mother doesn't care about money or status as much as my father does. Tell her about Rosie, about your work. Just be yourself." There was something in her tone, a weariness that made Garrett wonder what kind of pressure she'd been under her entire life. They spent the morning going over details, and Garrett found himself studying Juliet when she wasn't looking. She moved through her apartment with a kind of lonely precision, everything in its place, nothing personal visible except for a single framed photo on the mantel. A younger Juliet with her arms around a laughing woman who must be her mother, both of them covered in paint, grinning at the camera. It was the only sign that a real person lived in this perfect space. When they took a break, Juliet made coffee with the kind of expensive machine Garrett had only seen in magazine ads. "Can I ask you something?" he said carefully. "Why didn't you just tell your mother the truth? That you haven't had time for relationships?" Juliet was quiet for a long moment. "Because she spent her whole life making sure I had every opportunity, every advantage. And now she's dying thinking she failed because I'm alone. I can't let her go believing that." Friday afternoon, they drove to her family's home in a small Connecticut town 2 hours north of the city. Garrett had left Rosie with his sister, promising his daughter he'd be back Sunday night with enough money to make everything better. The lie tasted bitter, but Rosie had hugged him tight and told him she loved him, and that had to be enough. Juliet drove a sleek black sedan, her hand steady on the wheel even though Garrett could see the tension in her shoulders. The landscape changed from urban sprawl to rolling hills, dotted with fall colors, reds and golds that seemed almost offensively beautiful given the circumstances. They didn't talk much during the drive. Garrett watched the scenery and tried not to think about what he was about to do. The Morgan family home was a sprawling colonial with white columns and a wraparound porch, the kind of house that spoke of old money and established roots. Juliet's father, Richard Morgan, met them at the door, a tall man in his 60s, with steel-gray hair and the kind of handshake that felt like a test. His eyes assessed Garrett in seconds, cataloging the worn jacket, the work boots, the calloused hands. Garrett saw the disapproval register, but also the restraint, the way Richard's mouth tightened, but didn't speak. "Mother's resting in the sunroom," he said to Juliet, his voice carefully neutral. "She's been asking about you." Juliet squeezed Garrett's hand, the first genuine contact between them, and led him through a house filled with antiques and family portraits. Helen Morgan was tiny and frail, wrapped in blankets despite the warm afternoon, but her eyes were bright and alert when they entered the sunroom. She looked at Juliet with such pure love that Garrett felt like an intruder witnessing something sacred. Then her gaze shifted to him, and he saw curiosity and something that might have been hope. "So you're the one who's been keeping my daughter company," Helen said, her voice weak but warm. Garrett felt the lie lodge in his throat like a stone, but he managed to smile. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Garrett." Helen patted the seat beside her. "Come sit. Tell me everything." Juliet's been mysteriously vague, which means she actually cares about you. She only hides the things that matter. That first evening passed in a blur of careful conversation and watchful eyes. Richard Morgan said little, but his presence was a constant weight of judgment. Juliet's younger brother, Christopher, arrived with his wife and 2 young children, and the house filled with noise and motion that seemed to exhaust Helen, but also bring her alive. Garrett found himself naturally gravitating toward the children, fixing a broken toy truck with a twist tie and a paperclip, making the 3-year-old laugh by pretending to be unable to find his nose. He caught Helen watching him with an expression that made his chest tight with guilt. After dinner, while the family gathered in the living room, Helen asked him to help her to the garden. "I want to see the roses one more time before dark." They moved slowly, Helen leaning heavily on his arm, her breathing labored. The garden was beautiful in the fading light, late-season roses still blooming despite the approaching cold. Helen stopped by a white rose bush, touching the petals with gentle fingers. Juliet planted this when she was 12. She wanted something beautiful to last, even after we're gone. She looked up at Garrett, and in that moment, he knew she saw right through him. "You're not what I expected," she said quietly. "But you have kind eyes, and you know how to be gentle with small things. That matters more than anything else." Garrett wanted to confess everything, to tell her he was a fraud, that her daughter was paying him to be there. But Helen smiled. "Take care of her. She pretends she doesn't need anyone. But that's the biggest lie she tells." That night, Garrett barely slept in the guest room down the hall from Juliet's childhood bedroom. The house was too quiet, too perfect, and his mind wouldn't stop replaying Helen's words. Around 2 a.m, he heard soft footsteps in the hallway and found Juliet sitting on the stairs in the dark, her arms wrapped around her knees. She didn't seem surprised when he sat down beside her. "I can't sleep in this house anymore," she said quietly. "Too many memories of before, when she was strong." They sat in silence for a while, and then Juliet spoke again, her voice breaking. "I used to paint with her. That photo in my apartment, we were at an art class she dragged me to during college. I was stressed about exams, and she said I needed to remember how to create something just for joy. I haven't painted since she got sick. I don't know how to do anything just for joy anymore." Saturday was the anniversary celebration. An intimate gathering in the backyard with white tents and soft music and food catered by some place Garrett couldn't pronounce. Helen insisted on getting dressed up, wearing a blue dress that hung loose on her thin frame. But she smiled more that afternoon than Garrett had seen in the 24 hours he'd known her. Richard gave a toast about 35 years of partnership, his voice catching on the words, and Garrett saw the man behind the disapproval, someone watching his world crumble, helpless to stop it. Juliet held Garrett's hand throughout the celebration, and he couldn't tell anymore where the performance ended and something real began. The way she leaned into him when her mother started crying. The way her fingers tightened on his when the guests offered their sympathetic smiles. It all felt like more than pretending. Later, when most of the guests had left and twilight settled over the garden, Garrett found himself talking to Helen again. She wanted to know about Rosie, about being a single father, about the life he'd built from nothing but determination and love. He told her the truth, not about the arrangement with Juliet, but about everything else, about his wife dying when Rosie was 2, about the terrifying beauty of raising a child alone, about learning to braid hair from YouTube videos and reading the same bedtime story every night for 6 months because it was Rosie's favorite. Helen listened with tears streaming down her face. "That's what I wanted for Juliet," she said. "Someone who knows how to love more than they know how to succeed. Someone who shows up." She looked across the garden to where Juliet stood talking with her father. "She's forgotten how to show up for herself. Promise me you'll remind her." That night, everything fell apart. Garrett couldn't sleep again, and around midnight, he went downstairs for water. Voices carried from Richard's study, raised, angry. He knew he should walk away, but he heard Juliet's name and froze. "I had him investigated," Richard was saying. "He's got a criminal record, Juliet. 2 years for theft. Is this really the man you want Mother to think you're building a life with?" Garrett's stomach dropped. He'd been 23, desperate, stupid. He'd been caught stealing copper wire from a construction site to pay for his wife's medicine when she was sick. He'd served his time, rebuilt his life, but the record followed him like a shadow. Juliet's voice was cold. "What were you hoping to find, Dad? Proof that I'm making a mistake? Or proof that no one could possibly love me for who I am instead of what I have?" Garrett backed away before he could hear more, his face burning with shame. He should have known this would happen. Should have told Juliet about his past before agreeing to this insane plan. He made it halfway up the stairs before Juliet caught him, her face pale in the dim light. "You heard," she said, and it wasn't a question. Garrett nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "I should have told you. I needed the money so badly that I convinced myself it didn't matter." Juliet's hand found his arm. "It doesn't. My father is investigating you because he investigates everyone. He's terrified of losing control, of losing Mother, of losing me. But what he found doesn't change anything." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Unless you want to leave. I would understand." But Garrett didn't leave. They stood on those stairs, and something shifted between them. Juliet told him about the pressure of being Richard Morgan's daughter, about building a company to prove she was worthy of the family name, about the loneliness of success that came at the cost of everything else. And Garrett told her about the shame of his conviction, about the years of rebuilding trust, about the fear that he'd never be able to give Rosie the life she deserved. They talked until dawn started creeping through the windows, and somewhere in those hours, the performance became something neither of them knew how to name. When they finally went back to their separate rooms, Garrett knew he was in trouble. This wasn't supposed to be real. Sunday morning arrived with crisis. Garrett's phone rang at 6, his sister's voice panicked on the other end. Rosie had collapsed during the night. They were at the hospital, her kidneys failing faster than anyone had predicted. The doctors were saying hours, maybe a day, before dialysis wouldn't be enough anymore. She needed surgery now, or there might not be another chance. Garrett's world narrowed to a single point of terror. He was 2 hours away from his daughter, and she was dying. He barely remembered the next few minutes, stumbling out of the guest room, trying to explain to Juliet, watching her face go pale as she processed the information. "We're leaving now," she said, already moving. "I'll drive." "You're shaking too hard." The drive back to the city was a nightmare of traffic and panic. Juliet drove like she was racing death itself, her jaw set with determination, her hand occasionally reaching over to grip Garrett's when his breathing became too ragged. She didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations for why he'd agreed to this arrangement in the first place. She just drove, and somewhere in that desperate race against time, Garrett realized he'd fallen in love with her. Not because she was beautiful or successful or paying him, but because in this moment of his worst nightmare, she showed up. She didn't hesitate, didn't calculate, didn't protect herself. She just drove. They made it to the hospital in 1 hour and 20 minutes. Garrett ran through the corridors, his heart hammering against his ribs. Terror making his vision narrow. Rosie was in the ICU, tiny and pale against white sheets, and when she saw him, she smiled weakly. "Hi, Daddy," she whispered. "I'm sorry I got sick again." Garrett gathered her carefully against his chest, feeling her fragile heartbeat, smelling the antiseptic hospital smell mixed with her strawberry shampoo. "Don't be sorry, baby. Never be sorry. Daddy's here now." Over Rosie's head, he saw the doctor's grave expression. They were out of time. Surgery needed to happen in the next 12 hours, or they'd lose their window. The cost hadn't changed. $120,000 he still didn't have. Juliet appeared in the doorway, and Garrett saw something in her expression that made his breath catch. She stepped into the room, knelt beside the bed, and smiled at Rosie with a gentleness that seemed to transform her entire face. "Hi, sweetheart. I'm Juliet. Your daddy told me all about you." Rosie studied her with serious eyes. "Are you Daddy's friend?" Juliet's voice was soft. "I hope so. Would that be okay with you?" Rosie nodded slowly, then looked at her father. "She has kind eyes, Daddy, like the princess in my story who helped everyone." Something broke open in Garrett's chest. His 6-year-old daughter, fighting for her life, was trying to take care of him, trying to make sure he wasn't alone. Outside in the hallway, Juliet pulled Garrett aside. Her expression was determined, almost fierce. "I'm covering the surgery, all of it." Garrett shook his head immediately, the words tumbling out. "No, I can't let you do that. This wasn't part of our deal." "I won't take charity." Juliet cut him off, her voice sharp. "This isn't charity, and it's not about our deal. This is about a little girl who deserves to live, and a father who's been killing himself trying to save her, and the fact that I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, and none of it means anything if I can't use it to help someone who matters." She grabbed his hands, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Let me do this, Garrett. Please. Let me do something that actually means something." Garrett's pride warred with desperation, but when he looked through the window at Rosie, small and brave and fighting, the choice wasn't really a choice at all. He nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Juliet moved with immediate efficiency, pulling out her phone, making calls, arranging payment plans with the hospital administrators with the authority that left no room for argument. Within 2 hours, Rosie was being prepped for surgery, and Garrett was signing consent forms with shaking hands, while Juliet stood beside him, solid and present, and refusing to leave. "You don't have to stay," he told her. "You should go back to your family, to your mother." Juliet shook her head. "I'm exactly where I need to be." The surgery took 8 hours. Garrett paced the waiting room, drank terrible coffee, and tried not to imagine all the ways things could go wrong. Juliet sat beside him, her hand in his, not saying much, but just being there. Around hour 5, she started talking about her mother, about the guilt of leaving her this weekend, about the fear that Helen wouldn't last until she got back. "She told me to take care of you," Juliet said quietly. "Friday night in the garden. She said you had kind eyes, and I should hold on to that." She looked at Garrett, her expression raw. I thought she was confused, that the medication was making her sentimental. But she saw something I was too scared to admit, that this stopped being fake for me, somewhere between the garden and those stairs. Garrett's heart hammered. "Juliet." She shook her head. "You don't have to say anything. I know this started as a transaction. I know you needed money, and I needed a performance. But somewhere in there, it became real for me. The way you talked about Rosie, the way you were gentle with my mother, the way you stood on those stairs and let yourself be vulnerable. I've never met anyone like you. And I know we're from different worlds, and this is probably the worst timing imaginable. But I needed you to know. Whatever happens next, I needed you to know that you matter to me, that you've already changed my life just by showing up." Before Garrett could respond, the surgeon appeared, still in scrubs, exhaustion etched into his face, but smiling. The surgery had been successful. Rosie's new kidney was functioning, and barring complications, she would recover fully. Garrett felt his knees buckle, and Juliet caught him, held him, while he shook with relief so intense it felt like breaking apart. "She's going to be okay," he kept repeating, the words a prayer and a promise. "She's going to be okay." When he could breathe again, he looked at Juliet, saw his own relief reflected in her tears. "Thank you," he whispered. "I don't know how to thank you enough." Juliet cupped his face in her hands. "You already have. You reminded me what matters. You showed up for your daughter every single day, no matter what it cost you. That's everything." 2 days later, when Rosie was stable enough for visitors, Juliet returned with an unexpected guest. Helen Morgan, frail and wrapped in blankets, insisted on being wheeled into the hospital room to meet the little girl she'd heard so much about. Garrett was shocked. He'd assumed Juliet had gone back to Connecticut, that their strange weekend had ended when reality crashed back in. But here was Helen, smiling at Rosie with such warmth that the child immediately brightened. "Your daddy loves you very much," Helen told Rosie, holding her small hand gently. "And my daughter loves your daddy." "So I think that makes us something like family, don't you think?" Rosie looked at Garrett, then at Juliet, her expression serious. "Does that mean Juliet will come read me stories too?" Juliet knelt beside the bed, her voice thick with emotion. "Every single day, if you want me to." And watching them together, Rosie chattering about her favorite books, Helen smiling despite her obvious exhaustion, Juliet listening with complete focus, Garrett felt something settle in his chest that he'd thought he'd lost when his wife died. Hope. Not the desperate, clawing hope of survival, but the quiet, steady hope of building something real. Helen caught his eye and nodded, as if she could read his thoughts. Later, when Rosie had fallen asleep and Helen was resting in a nearby chair, Juliet pulled Garrett into the hallway. She wanted to come. She said she needed to meet Rosie before. Her voice broke. Garrett pulled her close, let her cry against his shoulder. "She likes you," he said softly. "My daughter has excellent taste." Helen Morgan passed away 3 days later, peacefully in her sleep with her family around her. Juliet called Garrett from the hospital, her voice hollow with grief, and he left Rosie in his sister's care to drive to Connecticut. He found Juliet sitting alone in the garden by the white rose bush, looking lost in a way that made his heart ache. He sat beside her without speaking, just being present the way she'd been present for him. After a long silence, Juliet leaned against him. "She told me the night before she died that she wasn't worried about me anymore. that she'd seen me with you and Rosie, and she knew I'd finally learned what mattered. Her voice was barely a whisper. She gave me her blessing to be happy, to build a life instead of just a legacy. The funeral was beautiful and heartbreaking, filled with people whose lives Helen had touched with her quiet kindness. Garrett stood beside Juliet, holding her hand through the service, meeting the curious glances of family and friends who clearly wondered who this stranger was beside the grieving daughter. Richard Morgan approached him after the service, his expression unreadable. "She liked you," he said gruffly. "My wife. She had good instincts about people." He paused, clearly struggling with something. "I looked into your background because I wanted to protect my daughter. But maybe what she needs isn't protection from mistakes. Maybe she just needs someone who shows up." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was something like acceptance. 6 months later, Garrett's small apartment had transformed into something that felt like home, in a way it never had before. Rosie was thriving, her energy returning day by day, her laughter filling spaces that had been too quiet for too long. Juliet showed up 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with books, sometimes just to sit and watch movies with them on the second-hand couch. She'd started painting again, bright abstract canvases that she claimed were terrible, but that Rosie insisted were masterpieces. Garrett had expanded his handyman business with a small loan from Juliet that he was paying back monthly despite her protests. Things were different now. Better. They moved slowly, carefully. Both of them aware of how precious and fragile this thing between them was. One Saturday afternoon, Juliet arrived with paint supplies and announced they were going to create a mural on Rosie's bedroom wall. They spent hours covering the walls with flowers and butterflies, with Rosie directing from her bed like a tiny art director, declaring certain petals needed to be bigger and that butterfly needed more purple. Garrett watched Juliet paint with complete focus, her hair pulled back, paint smudged on her cheek, laughing at Rosie's demands with genuine joy. This woman who'd built a financial empire was on her knees painting sunflowers for a 6-year-old, and she'd never looked more beautiful. When Rosie finally fell asleep, exhausted from directing her masterpiece, Juliet and Garrett stood in the hallway looking at their work. "It's perfect," he said. Juliet smiled. "She's perfect. You're both perfect." Garrett pulled her close, breathing in the scent of paint and lavender perfume. "I never said it back," he murmured. "In the hospital. You told me how you felt, and everything happened so fast I never said it back." Juliet's arms wrapped around his waist. "You don't have to." He cut her off with a kiss, gentle and certain. "I love you," he said against her lips. "I think I fell in love with you on that drive back to the city, when you didn't hesitate, when you just showed up. But I was terrified to say it because our whole thing started with a lie, and I didn't know if we could build something real on that foundation." Juliet's eyes were bright with tears. "We already have," she whispered. "Everything that matters has been real from the start." A year after that desperate weekend in Connecticut, they gathered in the same garden where Helen had touched her white roses one last time. It was a small ceremony, just family and close friends, but it felt perfect. Rosie stood beside them as flower girl, healthy and radiant in a pink dress she'd picked out herself, taking her job with solemn seriousness. Richard Morgan walked Juliet down the aisle, his hand steady on his daughter's arm, his eyes suspiciously bright. When he placed Juliet's hand in Garrett's, he leaned close and whispered, "Take care of my girls." Garrett understood he meant both his daughter and the granddaughter Rosie had already become in Richard's heart. "Always," he promised. The ceremony was simple. The vows they'd written themselves filled with promises about showing up, about choosing each other every day, about building a life based on what mattered instead of what looked good from the outside. When they were pronounced husband and wife, Rosie cheered louder than anyone, and the small gathering dissolved into laughter and applause. Later, during the reception in that same white tent where they'd celebrated an anniversary and hidden behind a performance, Juliet led Garrett to the white rose bush. It was blooming again, fuller than ever, new growth twining through the established branches. "Mom would have loved this," Juliet said softly. "She would have loved knowing we found our way here." Garrett pulled both his girls close, his wife and his daughter, and looked at the roses Helen had planted decades ago, still blooming, still beautiful despite storms and winters and time. "She knew," he said. "I think she knew before we did." And standing there in the garden, with the two people who'd taught him that love wasn't about perfection or performance, but about showing up even when it was hard, especially when it was hard, Garrett understood what Helen had tried to tell him that night, that the things worth having were the things you chose every day. That real meant messy and scared and brave all at once. That the best families weren't the ones that looked perfect in photographs, but the ones that held each other through the dark and showed up for each other in hospital corridors and painted butterflies at midnight. Rosie tugged on his jacket. "Daddy, did we get our happy ending?" she asked. Her voice filled with the wonder of a child who'd learned too young that happy endings had to be fought for, earned, built with careful hands and stubborn hope. Garrett looked at Juliet, saw his own answer reflected in her smile. "No, sweetheart," he said, kneeling down to his daughter's level. "We got our happy beginning. Everything good starts right here." And in the garden, where a dying woman had given her blessing to a love that started as a lie and became the truest thing either of them had ever known, they stood together and watched the roses bloom, already looking forward to whatever came next. Because they'd learned the most important lesson, that the best love stories aren't about perfect people finding each other, but about imperfect people choosing each other, again and again, every single day.